Yeah, so sorry, the first part of that clip I got interrupted with my son, so I wanted to finish this instead of wasting the first 17 minutes of recording. So basically, ended that clip talking about Hamilton favoring tariffs, and while Jefferson and a lot of his supporters were opposed to tariffs. So a lot of the Southerners didn't have industry, and so they wanted goods as cheap as possible, whether they were coming from Britain or France or American textile mills from New England. So that's why they favored either no tariffs or low tariffs. So one thing that is key to understand is their interpretation of the Constitution. Hamilton was a loose interpreter of the Constitution, which means if it was not specifically prohibited, then you can do it. While Jefferson, on the other hand, was a strict construction and interpretation of the Constitution. If it's not specifically allowed, then you cannot do it. So under Hamilton's view, it leaves you open to do a lot more things that a Jefferson supporter would not favor. While in Jefferson's view, you were limited to very little that you could actually do. So anyway, he wanted more states power. If you remember, Jefferson, even though he was over in France at the time of the Constitutional Convention, he would have been an anti-federalist most likely. Also, Jefferson big time opposed the national bank. He thought it was enabling the wealthy elite up in New England or New York area or Philadelphia to gain control. And he was opposed to it. Hamilton, on the other hand, favored national bank because typically in an economy, particularly in that day and age, and all the way to present day, in order for an economy to grow, you got to have banks that are lending money. And so that lending money would give you the opportunity to advance your business and so forth. So to give an example I always use for my students, I have a friend of mine from college who's well, he actually owns it now, but his father at the time owned a business where he built hot rod kits for, a lot of older retired men would do as a hobby. Not always, but that's typically the main buyer was. And so they would buy these kits, it would get shipped to them, and then they would assemble and build their own hot rod car. Well, they got approached back in 2008 by a fishing boat company to see if they would be willing to make these boat trailers for the fishing boat company so they could sell the trailer package with the boats because they didn't want to fool with actually making the fishing boat trailers. And so, because they knew they had some good, talented welders that worked for their business. So, problem is they need about a $250,000 loan in order to do that, and it would have potentially made well over $1 million in profits had they had that initial cash flow. So they went to the local banks to ask for a $250,000 loan, and they were denied. And the reason why is because it was in the fall of 2008, after the 2008 recession just happened. So, had they had that money to basically borrow from the bank, then they would have made over $1 million, and this would have paid back the loan with interest. The bank would have made money, and they would have also made even more money with this business proposal. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. So that's Hamilton's view, is that you need banks to lend money. Jefferson didn't like that. He thought banks could potentially become too powerful and so forth. All right, so if you ever want to, I would recommend that you print out this slide, just this slide only, and then you can kind of study it to get an idea of each of the Federalist views and then what Jefferson's party ends up becoming, the Democratic Republicans. Now, it's interesting that James Madison was originally a Federalist. That's going to change when John Adams is president with the Alien and Sedition Acts that we'll cover in a later lecture. So one thing to remember about their foreign policy that I haven't covered is that the Federalists were in favor of Britain, opposed to France. Remember that. The Democrat Republicans were in favor of France, opposed to Britain. Okay, that's going to be a key component to the problems that happened under Washington and Adams' presidencies in their foreign policy, because both of them dealt with a bunch of junk that was going on in the world that they had no control over, that they had to deal with that muck that was going on. All right, so let's talk about Hamilton's financial program. It's very important you understand this. Typically, you'll see it on a test, you'll see it on a quiz. So here's his policies. All right, first thing is he wanted to create a national bank that could house the U.S. currency and also provide loans for citizens and business development. Okay, Now, benefited from that were a lot of the wealthy financiers and merchants, which Jefferson pointed out. Okay. Now, he came up with 3 reports that he presented to Congress, and all of them were adopted because the Federalists held the majority in Congress during Washington's both terms. So it's a report on public credit. He argued that we need to borrow money in order to establish a history of credit, in order for Britain or the Dutch and Holland or France or whoever to give us a loan. And so he argued that these bonds that were sold during the American Revolution that were worthless, he recommended that we take those back and then reinstitute new government bonds. So basically, basically the United States economic system would go in debt to basically show that we can establish a credit history. So to put it in real world terms, I have a good friend of mine. He grew up a cattle farmer's son in Southwest Arkansas. And so never borrowed a dime in his life up to a certain point. And when he was in his mid to late 20s, newlywed, was living in Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex in Texas, and was trying to look at getting a home loan. He was denied. He had never borrowed a cent in his life. He paid cash for a brand new truck when he was out of college because he had worked and saved his money and never spent anything. He also never had a credit card. Was just very smart, frugal with his money. And so he was denied for a home loan because he had no credit history. So he literally had to take out a credit card for a year to establish a credit history, even though he didn't go into credit card debt, so that he could get approved for a home loan a couple years later for him and his wife. And so Hamilton is like, nobody's going to lend us money unless we show we have a history of paying back money responsibly. So that's what his report on public credit. Jefferson hated debt. So Jefferson would have been like a Dave Ramsey kind of guy today. Dave Ramsey is a famous financial guru, I guess you could call it, in the nation, who's against people having personal debt. Okay. Report on a national bank. That's going to found the national bank. Congress is going to adopt that. Jefferson hated it, but he has to deal with it. And then report on manufacturers. Basically, that is a tariff that protects U.S. industries, particularly the textile industries in New England. All right. So it is controversial because we didn't want debt. Okay. And these Articles of Confederation, government had issued bad government bonds. He wants us to take those back and issue new government bonds that are supposedly better, and that we're going to pay those back on interest. So Congress does adopt it, and we do go into debt permanently. And also the federal government was going to assume state debts. That was one thing that Jefferson was adamantly opposed to, because a lot of the northern states held the most debt, while his state of Virginia did not hold as much, or some of the southern states were not as bad off in terms of debt. And so he didn't like that. He thought it was just protecting one region of the country versus the other. So basically, how did they get this passed in Congress? Well, they created a compromise. Southerners are okay with adopting state debts, particularly the northern states, so long as the capital is moved further to the south. Now, D.C. is really not considered the South today, but back then it was. And so it was actually just down the Potomac River from George Washington's home. So it was moved to D.C., and that was a compromise. So they had to build Washington, D.C. from scratch. That's why the city is laid out fairly well, because they were able to lay it out with good planning. All right, so the National Bank, it was owned by the federal government and joint stockholders. So if you live in that day and age, you're wealthy and you own a portion of stock of the National Bank, you could own it. No, that is not Bank of America. Every year I have students that ask me that. No, it's not. The National Bank at this time in history is not Bank of America. Okay. So what's it going to do? It's basically going to make loans for merchants. So business people. Merchants are basically the term for business people for the late 1700s. Handle government funds. All right. Handle the U.S. Treasury, and issue bills of credit. Okay. Which that means is a loan. Okay, it's a loan, so it takes money to make money. They wanted to loan money so that people could make money back. So Hamilton said, hey, this is going to provide security, stability for our nation. Jefferson was adamantly opposed to it. It is modeled on the Bank of England. You know why? Because the Bank of England was extremely successful. And so Hamilton argued, if it's not broke, we don't need to fix it. Let's model it just like after they did. All right. So here's Hamilton's argument, and here's Jefferson's argument. You may want to print that out as well. All right. Now, tariff, we've covered that. It's a tax on imports to protect the American industry. So I think everybody understands what I explained that previously, what it was for. And so the other way that they brought in revenue was on a whiskey tax. So for a long time in American history, our two main sources of revenue for the entire nation, besides during the brief time of the Civil War when we had a income tax, until the 1910s when we passed the 16th Amendment that provided an income tax. The federal government's revenue came from selling of tariffs and a whiskey tax, okay, tax on alcohol. And we'll explain what that whiskey tax is going to lead to some controversy because a lot of alcohol makers in Western Pennsylvania are not happy about that. All right. Another problem that Washington is going to face is what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay, so I want you on your notes to put a star by this. A lot of times you'll have a quiz question on it, or at least a test question on the Whiskey Rebellion. So it's basically at this time, a lot of the people that live in the Appalachian region of Western Pennsylvania made their own homemade whiskey. So whiskey or bourbon is a unique alcohol to what is the United States. Rum was kind of made in the Caribbean. It's a sugary, much more sugar centered alcohol. Vodka and so forth is made kind of more in Eastern Europe. That was more popular, and you had beer in Germany and anyway other stuff. But with this whiskey, that was actually an truly American alcoholic drink, and they made their own whiskey, and they didn't like that their profits would be cut into because they're having to pay this whiskey tax. So they rebelled. Washington wanted to show the federal government was strong enough to handle that kind of rebellion, so he dispatched 10,000 soldiers to go put this rebellion down. Well, the whiskey rebels realized that they can't beat that, and they flee to the Appalachian Mountains and then don't make a fuss again. So the whiskey rebellion showed that the federal government was strong enough to handle insurrection. That's the main thing. That's the main importance and effect you need to remember about that. Okay. So I'm sorry, about 10 to 13,000 troops that came. All right. So we've covered this, but I want to emphasize this again. Hamilton envisions the United States becoming an industrial powerhouse. Jefferson envisioned the United States becoming an agricultural powerhouse. We become both. So both of their visions end up becoming a reality later in American history. And so Jefferson argued that an independent farmer didn't have to work for anybody and working for the man, so to speak, where a wage earner in a factory was. They called them like wage slaves. And so that's what Jefferson's argument was. It's just two different viewpoints at that time. All right, now here's where things went bad for, or at least caused problems in the United States, and that is the French Revolution. France, from 1789 until Napoleon is defeated in 1815, is going to cause all kind of havoc in the world. They had one of the most violent revolutions in world history. The only revolutions that can rival it in terms of violence are probably the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union and the Communist Revolution in China. But the French Revolution, for that day and age, was terrible. It's far worse than the American Revolution in terms of violence. So we don't have time to go into that. That's more of a world history two-course topic. But what ends up happening is France ends up fighting about all of their neighbors around them. And so if you remember, during the American Revolution, the French was the United States ally. So they asked us, brand new nation, to come to their aid in fighting against Britain. Well, the United States is in debt. We're weak. We don't have much of a military. Washington knew this would put the end to the United States. So what Washington did is he issued a proclamation of neutrality in 1793 and said, no, we're just going to remain neutral. We wish you well in your endeavors, but we're going to remain neutral. That angered France because they said that we had violated the Treaty of Alliance of 1778. So, but Washington was like, it will destroy us as a nation if we end up getting drug in there. So Washington made the wise decision. It was a tough decision, and one in which he is booed for a little bit, because what had happened later in the 1790s on the island of Haiti, well, it was Haiti and Dominican Republic today, Toussaint Louverture led the most successful slave revolt in world history and overthrew the French on their part of the island of Haiti, what they called Saint Dominique in French. And a lot of the French settlers in Haiti fled to Philadelphia, particularly, which at the time was the capital until Washington, D.C. was built. And a lot of them were trying to stir up um, American support for the French cause. And we'll cover that, what ends up being the result of that during John Adams' presidency. Okay. So when that happens, France gets mad at us for remaining neutral against the British. And so what was common at this time was this term called impressment. And impressment is a term you need to know and memorize. Basically, it's where you would stop a ship, a merchant vessel. You would come aboard, and you would take some of the better looking sailors and kidnap them and force them to be on your ship and in your navy. And so, as a way of recruitment, you would just capture merchant vessels and take some of their sailors and force them to work on your ship. One of the ways the British recruited for their navy was you'd be in a tavern, you get hit upside the head, knocked unconscious. Next morning, you're on a ship. Welcome to the British Navy. I can't make that up. That was actually one of the ways that they recruited. So, because the condition of the ships were not great, and it was tough work, and one that you didn't want to always be a part of by any means. And so the French impressed American ships, so did the British. And this is going to be one of the causes of the War of 1812 when the U.S. goes to war with Britain. Also, you can also take their cargo, so it's theft as well. All right, so we don't have time to go into the French Revolution a whole lot, but basically, poor people rise up against the nobility. They capture the king and queen, eventually behead both of them. A French guy by the name of Guillotine developed what they thought was a more humane way of killing somebody, besides having a person with an axe chop your head off or hanging. They have this weight that with this sharp blade that's released, it comes down and just cuts your head off. It's the most infamous scene of the French Revolution. So, because a couple of countries try to support the French monarchy and being restored, these French revolutionaries go to fighting against Britain. They go to fight against Austria. They go to fighting against Prussia at one point, Spain. It's a big old mess. So, the United States, we're going to remain neutral, still drug into this mess. And another problem with foreign policy that Washington deal with is that there are British forts, used to be French at one point, and they're on U.S. soil, and they haven't abandoned them. One of them was called Fort Niagara. In fact, my parents just last week went and toured Fort Niagara when they went to the Niagara Falls and went on this vacation trip up into Toronto and Buffalo, New York area, and loved it. But Fort Niagara was controlled by the French, and they controlled by the British, and the Americans held it at one point, and the British captured in the War of 1812, and yada, yada, yada. So, but that's an example of one fort that was on U.S. soil. And so in these forts, the British happened to be supplying the Native Americans their weapons. Okay. Part of the reason why the British gave the land in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, okay, is because they knew the Native Americans controlled it, and they were happy to arm the Native Americans to fight against the Americans. Now, if you got the U.S., whose population is doubling every 25 years, those people are, as they grow up, are going to want cheap, affordable land. Well, that is only found in the West. And so as land in the East is going up in value because of the increased population, then people are going to try to go west to find cheap, available land. Well, that's on Native Americans. Native Americans are feel threatened. They gain weapons from the British and also the Spanish, and they retaliate against American settlers. And that's going to lead to numerous conflicts that takes place. And later also leads to the War of 1812. Now let's talk about Jay's Treaty. Now this was very controversial that Washington signs. Washington doesn't like it. The reason why Washington signs it is because it keeps us out of war with Britain. So Britain knew we remained neutral with the French, but we weren't really pro-British either. Of course, we just gained independence from them. It makes sense. And we were angry about them still having forts on our territory and arming the Native Americans. The British were angered at us because we agreed in the Treaty of Paris to pay back our debts that we had owed before the American Revolution, which we didn't. We didn't restore the Loyalist property and so forth like we had promised as well. So they're not happy. So what Jay's Treaty does is require the U.S. to pay back our old debts, okay, from before the Revolution, Britain's going to remove all of its fort or remove troops out of its forts from U.S. soil, allowed the United States to negotiate separate treaties with Native Americans, which opened up Western settlement. Okay, now that three of those four things Americans would have been happy about. But the second bullet is the one that Washington got booed for, ended up burning effigies of John Jay, poor guy, doing the best he can. We're kind of a weak young nation against big, powerful Britain. They weren't going to help us. They weren't going to, where we get every point in the negotiation that we would get. They required us to give something in return, and that happened to be the debt from before the American Revolution. So Britain is going to make it very difficult to have neutrality. And you can see all these forts and so forth. There's Fort Niagara right by Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And so basically, the United States got our ships that was trading in the West Indies, which is the Caribbean today, kept getting attacked. In fact, they impressed about 300 American sailors, the British did. And so Jefferson, who is pro-France, called for war. The Federalists, on their hand, who are pro-British, said, no, we shouldn't do that. You know why? Because Britain is one of our most important trade partners. If not our most important trade partner, if we go to war with them, we can't trade with them. Therefore, we can't make money off of them. Now, so Jay's Treaty, controversial, but nonetheless, it does agree that the United States is going to pay back its pre-Revolutionary War debt. It does get Britain to abandon the forts, but it does not stop impressment. Okay. And that is going to be one of the two causes of the War of 1812. So remember that when we get to Module 4. Jay's Treaty does not stop impressment, and impressment is one of the two things that causes the War of 1812. So what does Jay's Treaty does? John Adams is going to win the presidency in 1796. He gets inaugurated in 1797. But the Democrat Republicans, who had kind of looked like they were not going to be any significant political party in American history, Jay's Treaty actually leads to their growth. And eventually they're going to overtake the Federalists, and they become the largest political party in America. And later that Democrat-Republican Party is going to split into the Democrats and these kind of what ends up becoming the Whig Party. It goes by a different name for a few years, but it becomes the Whigs. And so the Federalist Party is going to kind of die out in history by 1820. And we'll cover that in Module 3. So anyway, Spain, on the other hand, feared after Jay's Treaty that we would ally with Britain. And remember, Spain was arming the Native Americans in the South, like the Cherokee and the Creeks and the Chickasaws, Choctaws, and the Seminoles. And so Spain was like, well, we don't want to fight a war with Britain because Spain already had fought a couple wars with Britain. And so they decided to create a treaty themselves to give us free use of the Mississippi River. And I'll cover it. That's called Pinckney's Treaty. Named after Charles Pinckney, who was the American negotiator, sometimes called the Treaty of San Lorenzo, because San Lorenzo was the Spanish guy who negotiated the treaty. But you can call it whatever you want in terms of Pinckney's Treaty or Treaty of San Lorenzo, if you ever had to write an essay or something on this. So we got free use of the Mississippi River for 5 years. And the boundary, instead of being further north, up about midway up to Mississippi and Alabama, almost to Tennessee, basically, it gave us all the way down to where the Florida Panhandle is. So that's a good deal for the United States. Okay. So one of the things that Washington is going to try to have us do, and we're going to follow his lead for the most part until about World War I. Now, we do get involved in foreign affairs somewhat in the late 1800s and the Gilded Age, but we'll cover that in U.S. history too in the first unit. And so Washington gives this riveting farewell address, basically arguing against political parties, warning of their potential devastating effects, and also warned us to stay out of foreign affairs. And we do that until we get to the world wars, for the most part. They also warned about foreign alliances, which we followed that until the world wars. All right, so let's talk about Adams becoming president. And we're going to cover his presidency pretty quickly because Adams only was president for 4 years. He was a one-term president. Jefferson was his vice president. And eventually Jefferson resigns from being vice president, and actually him and John Adams' friendship kind of gets cooled. They were close friends. And then they rekindle their friendship later in life through letters when John Adams' wife Abigail dies. Adams barely defeats Jefferson 71-68 electoral college, and they originally start out okay, and then as time goes along, because of what's happening with France, Jefferson and Adams have a feud, and their friendship kind of breaks up. All right. So when Jay's Treaty is signed by George Washington, really, Washington doesn't have to deal with the fallout as much as Adams does. By the time Adams becomes president, France is hot mad about it, and they don't respect the United States and are going to pretty much dish us pretty good. And so they began particularly impressing American ships. By 1797, they'd already impressed 300 U.S. merchant ships. In today's times, that would be an act of war. And if it wasn't for us being weak and having not much of a military and Adams being a relatively peaceful man, we would have gone to war. In fact, his entire party favors going to war. In fact, if Adams would have gone to war, he would have been reelected in the election of 1800. But one of the reasons why I love John Adams is because he sacrificed his political career for the betterment of the nation and kept us from going to war, knowing we would be destroyed by France. Okay. So let's talk about the first bit of controversy that happens under Adams' presidency. So he sends some diplomats to go meet with the French to hopefully get them to quit jacking with our ships and impressing our sailors. He sends John Marshall, Charles Pinckney, and John Jay. It's interesting. You have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who always goes to negotiate treaties, but he was pretty good at it. When they go there is a French foreign minister by the name of Talleyrand. And Talleyrand won't even meet with the Americans. He sends 3 other French guys to try to meet with them, and they basically demand that the United States pay a $250,000 bribe just to even talk with Monsieur Talleyrand. And so it becomes known in the American newspapers as XYZ affair because it wouldn't even tell the American diplomats their names, so we called them X, Y, and Z. And it's a huge insult. And so what ends up happening is the U.S. and France fight an undeclared war. Now, they don't ever fight on land. They never officially declared war on each other. But if we saw a French vessel, we would fire. If they saw an American vessel, they would fire at us. But we never actually officially declared war. It wasn't really as big of a widespread deal as it sounds. Mostly it dealt with ships in the Caribbean. So, undeclared naval war. In fact, John Adams, one of his claim to fame for any U.S. military personnel is that he actually founded the U.S. Marines. And so one of his claim to fame was the U.S. military. All right. So this is a political cartoon of the day making fun of France. Okay. These people on the guy's head are supposed to be the X, Y, Z people. And not only that, France demands an apology for signing Jay's Treaty and that we give them $12 million, which, by the way, we were majorly in debt. We didn't have $12 million if we took it from all of his citizens across the nation, probably. That was basically just showing us that we're weak and France is somewhat strong at that time. So there was a quote going around the American population, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. So at this time as well, as you have a bunch of French citizens living in Philadelphia. The reason why they didn't flee back to France, because a lot of them were wealthy planters, and you remember in the French Revolution, wealthy people were targeted. When they flee from Haiti, they go to Philadelphia. Well, they're, while in Philadelphia, are stirring up people to support the French Revolution and their war against Britain and all these other countries. One thing I did forget to mention as well is there was a diplomat first served to Washington called Citizen Jeanette, who demanded that the United States fight on behalf of France. He refuses. Jeanette tries to rouse up political support for the French. Jefferson sends a letter to France. He gets in trouble and ends up asking for political exile in the U.S. because he thought the French were going to kill him if he came back with the guillotine. All right. So between 1798 and 1800, we have an undeclared naval war with France fought basically in the Caribbean. And so we captured about 80 French ships, not bad for the U.S. Navy. And basically we began, Adams agreed with Alexander Hamilton to found an army, began training, but eventually disbands it because he wants peace, and ends up getting it at the very end of his presidency after he had lost election. So basically, you have impressment back and forth, back and forth. U.S. trying to defend its honor and so forth. And so Congress actually authorized anytime you see an American vessel, you can shoot it and capture it. We have no trade with France, no selling or buying. We renounce the Treaty of Alliance, see ya. And then we also formed a part of the Navy. So hoorah, America. And then it ends in the early 1801, right before Jefferson comes in for his presidency when Adams is leaving. He finds out right after the election that his negotiations with Napoleon were effective and the undeclared naval war is off. Reason why that Napoleon, when he comes into power in late 1799, early 1800, is because Napoleon doesn't care about the United States. He wants to conquer and invade the rest of Europe, which is what he tries to do until he is finally defeated in 1814 and then again in 1815. So, but anyway, Napoleon ends up negotiating that. And because we were nice to France at that negotiation, later Napoleon's going to be a lot nicer and sell the United States Louisiana Purchase in Jefferson's presidency that we'll cover in Module 3. So way to go, John Adams. All right, now, one thing that John Adams did do that was bad was he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, now the Alien and Sedition Acts, I want you to, when you take notes on it, I want you to star it, circle it, underline it, whatever. It's almost always on a quiz, and it will be on a test. Okay, so basically what it was is the Federalists are sick of newspapers griping and complaining about what the Federalists are doing. They worry that it can lead to further problems and lead to further conflicts. So also because of all these French sailors coming in from Haiti, they passed this thing called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, it really consists of three things that we call Alien and Sedition Acts in history because of two of the more infamous things. The first thing it passed was what's called a Naturalization Act. So normally you could become a U.S. citizen if you immigrated from Ireland or Germany or Holland or Spain or wherever within 5 years. But then they moved it back to 14 years. You had to live in the country for a decade and a half to become a U.S. citizen. That was aimed at those French settlers coming from Haiti. The Alien Act authorized the deportation of foreigners. So the president could deport any foreigner if he deemed necessary who may be rousing support to go to war. Remember, the Federalists are pro-British. Okay. And lastly, the Sedition Act, and this was the thing that was probably the most controversial because it directly violates the First Amendment. And if you published insults or malicious attacks on the president or members of Congress, you could be in prison. Okay, so it was prohibited. You'll remember this throughout American history. Anytime First Amendment rights are reduced or suspended, it's in a time of war. Okay, we have this with the quasi-naval war with France, which was undeclared naval war. We have it again in Civil War. We have it again in World War I, World War II, and also in the War on Terror with the Patriot Act. Okay, so Adams, his grave mistake of his presidency is to sign him into law. And so his party supported him doing it, but it leads to more support for the Democrat Republicans and leads to Jefferson beating him in 1800. So about 20 newspaper editors and politicians went to jail, and it does violate free speech. Okay, I'm going to read that, and it tells you actually what the bill did. And both very controversial. The Democrat Republicans don't sit quietly on this. They write a response, and it's what's called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And they said that, well, if a state saw something passed by Congress as unconstitutional, they have the right to nullify it, which means they turn their back on it and not abide by it. And this is where you see the first time that states' rights is advocated on a large-scale issue. And states' rights is one of the causes of the American Civil War. Okay, so this is going to culminate with our last module of the year of this course, U.S. History 1, with states' rights coming up again, dealing with states' rights with slavery. Okay, and so the Virginia Kentucky resolutions, highlight it, circle it, star it in your notes, argued that states had the right to nullify something they deemed as unconstitutional. Okay. All right. So nullification will not be the last time we hear about this. We'll hear about the nullification crisis again in the 1830s, and we'll cover it in a later lecture in much more detail with new Southerners. Jefferson is deceased by this point. That began pushing for um, a new nullification crisis. Okay. All right. So Hamilton gets angered at John Adams for not going to war with France and disbanding the army. So he runs another guy against Hamilton, a guy by the name of Pinckney. And what happens is it splits the Federalist vote. The Democrat Republicans run two candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. If you ever seen the Hamilton musical, you remember that Aaron Burr is the one who shoots Hamilton in the duel. And if the Democrat, if well, really, if the Federalist Senate ran two candidates, if you combine all their votes in the Electoral College, John Adams would easily win. Problem is it splits their votes, and John Adams becomes the third most in votes because Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson actually tie in the election of 1800. And so, but all that took place right as the negotiations with Napoleon happened. And that news didn't get back in time. Had it did, Adams might have won re-election, certainly, and he sacrificed his own political career for the betterment of the nation. And so he got 65 votes to 73. And what happens when you have a tied electoral college is it goes to the House of Representatives, and Jefferson prevails. And Adams decided not to intervene, and then it kind of causes a further rift between him and Jefferson. So Burr becomes the vice president of Jefferson in his first term. He's not the vice president in the second term. And to eliminate future problems, they passed the 12th Amendment. So the Revolution of 1800, last thing we'll cover, it's a peaceful transition of power from one political party to the next. And that's one of the coolest things about American history is that in each election where there's a change of power from one political party to the other, we have a peaceful transition of power. A lot of countries in the world do not have that. And we'll come back to Adams' midnight appointments. We'll start that with at the beginning of Module 3 because that really affects what we cover in Module 3 and so forth. So please email if you have any questions about any of this material.